Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Sorry for some technical glitches just there. My name is Bernard Prusak, and I'm the director of the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at King's College, which is in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. King's is a Catholic liberal arts college sponsored by the Congregation of Holy Cross, and Wilkes-Barre, just in case you don't know, is in the northeast corner, more or less, of the state. This is the 8th of 9 second semester events hosted by the McGowan Center for our academic community and for friends of the college. This event is also doubling as the 13th event in the series Catholic Higher Education in Light of Catholic Social Thought. That series comprises 14 events, the last is tomorrow, hosted by 8 institutions across the country. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my collaborator and co-editor in that project, Jennifer Reed Booley from College of St. Mary in Omaha, Nebraska. Thanks also to those of you among the audience who have attended other events in that series. And I imagine we also have some hosts among us and probably some presenters in that event too. So thank you very much. Thanks now to our presenters, Matt Mazewski and Margarita Rose, for being here and for being willing to speak with us about our topic today. Matt Mazewski is a PhD candidate in economics at Columbia University. His research deals with topics in labor economics, including collective bargaining, employee ownership, and the measurement of monopsony power in labor markets. Before going to graduate school, Matt worked in the Research and Statistics Group at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. In addition to his academic work, he's a contributing writer and book critic at Commonweal magazine, for which he writes about economics, politics, and Catholic social thought. So I encourage you to check out Matt's writing. And if you don't know Commonweal magazine, check that out too. Matt is also a volunteer organizer with the graduate workers of Columbia, the university's Union of Teaching and Research Assistants. Margarita Rose will be our respondent. She is professor of economics at King's College. Her area of specialization is development economics with a focus on microfinance and women's economic empowerment in East Africa. She also directs our study abroad programs in Uganda. And I know she's eager to get back on the road or back in the air and so on and so forth. So pandemic be gone. Let's hope that can happen sometime soon. Her work over the last 6 years with other scholars in the CST, so Catholic Social Thought or Social Teaching or Social Tradition, Learning and Research Initiative, resulted in the development of a rubric to assess student learning of CST and 2 articles in the Journal of Catholic Higher Education, one examining the licensing and investment practices of Catholic colleges through the lens of CST. That explains why she's our respondent this afternoon. Her current project investigates how graduates of Catholic colleges engage with CST. So thank you all for being here with us. This event is being recorded. I'll post the recording maybe later today, maybe tomorrow, on both the McGowan Center's YouTube channel and Facebook page. And I'll also send a link to all of you. So we'll follow our normal structure. Matt will present for about a half hour or so. Margarita then will respond for looks like around 7 minutes. That's my bet. At that point, we'll turn to Q&A. I'll serve as the moderator. I imagine most of you have spent maybe too much time on Zoom already. We're going to use the chat function at the bottom of the page for the Q&A. The chat is set to host only. Send questions to me. There are 3 hosts, me, Matt, and Margarita. Send questions to me, and I'll do my best to introduce your questions into the mix. We'll go, between an hour and an hour 15. So probably end, well, for sure end by 5:15. If you can, send questions while Matt's presenting, send questions while Margarita's responding. It'd be great to have some questions on hand before we come to Q&A time. Okay, thank you again to all of you, and thanks especially to Matt and Margarita. Matt, take it away.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Bernard. And I'd also like to thank Jennifer Reed Booley for inviting me to contribute to the volume that these lectures are based on. And I also want to thank Margarita Rose for being the respondent today, and thank all of you for coming. Looking forward to the discussion. So let me share my screen here, and everybody can see that. Okay. All right. So so the title of this presentation is Hedge Funds Running Catholic Schools on the Side, Divestment, Reinvestment, and the Economic Ethics of Financing Catholic Higher Education. So there's this this quip that I find amusing about how at some of the most elite universities, the endowments have essentially become so large that you can basically think about the schools themselves as almost a side business. So the first place that I encountered this observation was a few years ago. There was a slate of candidates running for the Harvard Board of Overseers, which is essentially the university's board of trustees, that was called Free Harvard, Fair Harvard. And part of their platform was that Harvard should essentially use its massive endowment to make the entire university completely tuition free. And so there was this quote that they had on their website where they said that Harvard is now one of the world's largest hedge funds, with its $38 billion portfolio tax exempt because of the college it runs as a charity off to one side. Paying tuition to a giant hedge fund is unconscionable, and Harvard should immediately abolish all college tuition. Now, I mean, Harvard is kind of an outlier. You know, it's not the case that every school is as wealthy as Harvard, certainly, or even coming anywhere close. And certainly no Catholic school controls a portfolio as large as Harvard's, which is the largest of any university in the United States. But that said, the combined endowment assets of Catholic universities nevertheless constitute a really enormous pool of capital and a source of economic power. And in a minute, I'm going to show you some statistics to try to delineate exactly how large this pool of capital really is. And you know, debates about divestment are a recurring theme in higher education, and you know, divestment from fossil fuel companies, but further back in time, divestment from apartheid South Africa. You know, these issues have been with us for a long time, and they crop up at both religious and secular institutions. And so they show that there is a widespread awareness of the need to scrutinize this economic power and examine how it's being used and whether it's being used in a way that accords with moral principles and commonly shared values. But you know, I would argue that this is especially true at Catholic colleges and universities, which ostensibly ought to be governed in accordance with the principles of Catholic social thought or Catholic social teaching. So in a way, Catholic universities should be holding themselves to an even higher standard. And this is just a quotation from John Paul II's encyclical on Catholic universities, in which he says that, you know, a Catholic university as Catholic informs and carries out its research, teaching, and all other activities with Catholic ideals, principles, and attitudes. Catholic teaching and discipline are to influence all university activities, and any official action or commitment of the university is to be in accord with its Catholic identity. So this is just, you know, one example of acknowledgement in the tradition that you know, Catholic universities need to be adhering to Catholic principles, not just in their you know, in their activities in the classroom, but also in their operation as a business, basically. So the key idea here, or the key point that I want to argue in this presentation and in the chapter that I'm contributing to the volume, is that creatively deploying the collective assets of CCUs, which is an abbreviation I borrow from Margarita Rose, an article that she wrote that I'll talk a little bit about later, refers to Catholic colleges and universities, that creatively deploying these assets could help fund Catholic higher education while also bringing about more humane economic institutions that otherwise face obstacles to taking root in our current economic system. So, you know, any revenue generating activities that are undertaken by universities, not just investment, but negotiating licensing agreements, soliciting donations, operating businesses like hospitals or university presses, these all have moral implications. So, you know, any activity that's undertaken to raise money for a university needs to be done in a morally serious way. But my focus here is going to be on CST and this problem of how to invest or not invest endowment resources, not because these other issues are unimportant, but because, you know, these questions of investment have generally been treated as questions that face individual universities or that face the administrators of individual endowments, rather than questions that face the whole network of Catholic colleges and universities, understood as a collection of actors that have a shared faith tradition. And so what I want to argue is that CST principles point to a critique of the inequality among CCUs themselves, and that a focus on the investment decisions of individual universities overlooks this kind of collective issue. So, the idea here is we don't want Catholic universities to end up becoming the side businesses of hedge funds. We don't want, we don't want them to become, we don't want this to be the case that the investing is not being done in a morally serious way. Okay, so before I get into talking about the ethical concerns or the analysis from the perspective of CST, I just want to present some empirical facts that I think will help kind of give a picture of the size of the endowments and some facts about their distribution. So some preliminary questions that we could ask are, what is the total value of the endowment wealth that's held by CCUs? And how does this compare to the total wealth that's held by all private universities in the United States? How have these figures changed over time? How have they grown? How unequal is the distribution of endowment wealth across CCUs? And how does this compare to the same for private non-Catholic colleges and universities, what we'll abbreviate as NCCUs? So is endowment wealth distributed more or less equally among CCUs than among NCCUs? And how important are investment returns as a source of financing for Catholic higher education compared to other sources of revenue, like tuition, fees, grants, donations, so on and so forth? Okay, so where can we get some data to answer these questions? Well, one great resource is this data source called IPEDS, which is the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System that's maintained by the National Center for Education Statistics, which is an arm of the US Department of Education. So this is data that's compiled by the federal government based on required filings from universities. So unfortunately, in IPEDS, you can't easily see, you can't easily check a box and say, I want to see Catholic universities. So we create a list of CCUs that's taken from the website of the Usccb Committee on Education. So on the Usccb website, they have a list of all colleges and universities in the United States that are recognized as Catholic, and there are 246 institutions on that list. Turns out that only a subset of them actually appear in IPEDS, and I believe the reason for that is that some of them are seminaries that are not required to file the same sort of filings that other private colleges and universities are. So as far as the time frame that this data covers, the series begins in 2008, or IPEDS goes back further, but the detailed information on endowments becomes available in 2008, and the most recent year available is 2019. So I'm going to present some information on CCUs, but then the comparison group, what we're calling the NCCUs, is all 2-year and 4-year private universities that appear in IPEDS. So I'm ignoring public universities and ignoring for-profit universities because, in some sense, these are not really a relevant comparison group. There are no public Catholic colleges or there are no for-profit Catholic colleges. So we're going to consider the peer institutions here to be 2-year and 4-year private. Okay, and so it changes over time, but in IPEDS, there's on the order of 12, 13, 1,400 of those in any given year. Okay, so just some basic facts here. So total endowment wealth of private universities in 2019 was close to $500 billion. And if you want to compare that to the size of the US economy, that's on the order of 2 to 3% of US GDP. This has grown substantially over the last decade or so. This is nearly double the figure in the years after the Great Recession. I think in 2010, the comparable figure was 246 billion. So endowment wealth has almost doubled in the last decade or so. So of that total, 409 billion was held by non-Catholic universities and 38 billion by CCUs. So slightly less than 10% of the total is held by CCUs. So what's interesting actually is that endowments at CCUs seem like they've been growing a little bit faster than those at NCCUs on average. The average annual growth rate at CCUs has been 4.2% over the last 10 years. And for the NCCUs, it's been 3.1%. So just to show you a picture here, this is a graph that shows change in total endowment assets at private universities, both non-Catholic and Catholic over the sample period. Okay, so the dotted line is non-Catholic and the straight line is Catholic. So it's kind of interesting if you look at this graph, you think that the endowment wealth of non-Catholic universities has been growing a lot faster because this line looks a lot steeper and this line looks pretty flat. But given that this is calculated off of a smaller base, it turns out the percentage growth rate at Catholic universities has actually been slightly faster. Okay, and so you can see that if you look at the fraction of all endowment assets that are accounted for by Catholic universities has been growing a little bit over time, is around 8.5% now. Okay. If we look at dividing the size of these endowments by the number of students to try to get some sense of the resources that are available for the average student at one of these universities, we find that endowments per full-time student are substantially lower on average at CCUs. So in the most recent year, only about $44,000 per student, whereas at NCCUs, it was over $100,000 per student. But this is mostly driven by the fact that the wealthiest NCCUs, so you should think of Harvard, other Ivy League schools, are much wealthier than the wealthiest CCUs. So when we average across all schools, these extremely wealthy places like Harvard and Yale and so on are pulling the average way up. So you know, it might be more helpful to look at something like median endowment wealth per student rather than average to try to deal with that skewed distribution. What's interesting is actually if you try to measure this concentration, is that it seems like endowment wealth is slightly more unequal for CCUs than for NCCUs. So in the economics of industrial organization, a lot of times one measure of how concentrated a market is that people like to look at is the market share that's held by the top 4 firms. So you can think of, if we want to know how concentrated the airline industry is, we can look at the revenues of the top 4 airlines, and that gives us some, as a fraction of total revenues, and that gives us some sense of how concentrated that market is. So if we apply that measure here to try to look at how concentrated wealth is, where'd it go? So we see that actually the top 4 Catholic universities, the wealthiest 4 half of all universities, whereas the top 4 non-Catholic universities hold only just under 1/3 of the wealth of non-Catholic universities. So that's somewhat interesting that even though the wealthiest non-Catholic schools are much wealthier, it actually seems like wealth is a little bit more concentrated among Catholic schools. Just going back here, this is a graph showing how the average endowments per student have changed over time. So again, as we might expect, they've gone up because we know that overall endowment wealth has gone up, and it's gone up faster than enrollments have grown. And this graph is showing you the distribution of endowment assets at private institutions. So the dotted line, again, non-Catholic schools, the solid line, Catholic schools. And so what this is showing you is on the horizontal axis, we have percentiles. And then on the vertical axis, we have the size of their endowment. So this is showing you that, the bottom 20% of institutions, their endowments are negligible. The bottom 50% of institutions, their endowments are negligible. And even when you get up above the 90th percentile for both Catholic and non-Catholic institutions, we're talking about the 90th percentile, maybe $1 billion or so. And then beyond that, at the very top of the distribution, it just really shoots up. So, this is really underscoring the point that to this comment about how universities are becoming hedge funds running schools on the side, that comment really does only apply to a handful of the very wealthiest universities. Most universities, their endowments are nowhere near that of a Harvard or a Yale. What are these schools? I keep mentioning Harvard and Yale. If you look at the top 10 non-Catholic private universities, you see it's a bunch of Ivy League schools: Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Penn, Columbia, but then also places like Stanford, MIT, Duke, Northwestern, Emory. What are the top 10 Catholic? We have Notre Dame is the wealthiest Catholic university, followed by Boston College, Georgetown, St. Louis University, Santa Clara, Holy Cross, St. John's, Fordham, Villanova, and Marquette. If we want to compare, how do the wealthiest Catholic universities compare to the wealthiest non-Catholic? Well, Notre Dame has about an $11 billion endowment. And so if we fit that into the ranking of non-Catholic universities, that it comes in the top 10, but it's the only one that does. So Boston College and the rest of them are well outside of the top 10. So that kind of gives you a sense of, how the magnitudes compare, but then also how the concentration compares. Like you can see that Notre Dame's endowment is, 4 or 5 times as large as even the one in the number 2 slot, which is Boston College. Okay, and then the last question that we were trying to look at was, how important are investment returns as a source of revenue? So, to this comment about Harvard being able to abolish tuition, this kind of presupposes that tuition is a relatively unimportant component of where Harvard's revenues are coming from. Most of its revenues are coming from investments, and so it could easily get rid of tuition. So that was the claim of this slate of candidates. It could get rid of tuition, and it would be able to make that up with investment returns. But we want to know how reliant on investment returns versus tuition are Catholic schools on average, and how does that compare to non-Catholic universities? So on average, 60% of revenues at CCUs in the latest year came from tuition and fees, and only less than 5% came from investment returns. So this really suggests that these schools are very heavily reliant on tuition. And at non-Catholic universities, the figures were similar. There were about 56% of revenues coming from tuition, and about 5.7% of revenues coming from investments. So that kind of should make clear that most universities on average are not hedge funds with a school on the side. At the top 10, though, if we look at what are the wealthiest, what does it look like for the wealthiest universities? Well, at the top 10 CCUs, the figures were not that much different. About 50% of revenues coming from tuition and about 9% of revenues coming from investment. But at the top 10 non-Catholic schools, the picture was very different. So 11% of revenues coming from tuition and a quarter of revenues coming from investment returns. So now you start to see how people might make the claim that Harvard is not so reliant on tuition. Okay, so then this just kind of presents the same point graphically. Where are revenues coming from? Well, at Catholic institutions, most revenues are coming from tuition. That's the first big bar. Investment returns is the orange bar, so not very much. And then the other sources of revenue are things like gifts, donations. Public appropriations are pretty negligible because most Catholic universities are not really receiving state support except in the form of maybe grants for research or things like that. And then the rest of the money is coming from revenue from sales, services, things like university presses, hospital revenue, and so on. Okay, and then just making the point that at non-Catholic institutions, the picture is pretty similar unless you zoom in and look at the very top, and then you see these wealthiest NCCUs are really not that dependent on tuition. Okay, so that kind of hopefully gives some helpful context for what is the size of the pool of endowment wealth that we're talking about, and role in managing Catholic higher ed. So now I want to switch gears a little bit and focus more on the issue of moral reasoning about investing, and then get to the ultimate point I want to make about how we could think about collectively deploying the endowment resources of these Catholic universities. So, most discussions about Catholic social thought and investing, and especially in the university context, tend to think in terms of these familiar moral theological frameworks of cooperation with evil or the principle of double effect. So one reference that I think is really illuminating here is this study by Albino Barrera about market complicity in Christian ethics. And this is kind of the primary framework that he relies on to think about entanglements with moral evil through economic interactions. And so one way that these frameworks have traditionally been employed or traditionally been applied is through negative screens. So the concept of a negative screen is some criteria that you have where you as an investor assembling a portfolio or examining an existing portfolio with an eye towards making it more morally sound, is you filter out some set of bad investments in order to minimize complicity with or causal contribution to some set of activities that you deem to be morally problematic. So when I say bad investments, I don't necessarily mean badly performing investments. I just mean morally dubious or tainted investments. But you can also think about this reasoning as pointing towards positive screens. So a positive screen would be some criterion that's used to help you pursue good investments, or to guide you in developing activist strategies. So where you invest in things that might be morally problematic in some way, but you use your power as an investor to try to force change. So you introduce shareholder resolutions, you vote on members of the board of directors, you try to steer the direction of the company in a more productive way or more morally sound way. So the Usccb socially responsible investment guidelines, which have been updated several times over the years, kind of discuss these different approaches to moral reasoning about investment. Though some have pointed out, Purcell and Rose in particular, have pointed out that although they kind of discuss each of these different types of approaches, negative screen, positive screen, activist investing, they really in practice seem to put a lot of emphasis on negative investing, negative screens, on avoiding entanglements with companies that are involved in abortion, in arms production, pornography, things like that. But there's also this sounds easier said than done, but this raises a lot of questions about exactly what counts as a bad investment, what counts as a good investment. I mean, it's obviously not so simple as saying certain companies are immoral and other companies are moral. The economy is so interconnected, and firms in the modern economy are so complex and involved in so many different lines of business that really any investment is going to involve some kind of entanglement with problematic activity. And so this becomes a question of where do you draw the line? So I think it can be frustrating, and there can be different temptations here. So one temptation is moral rigorism, that you become so concerned about avoiding entanglements with anything that can be deemed problematic that you engage in really purist investment strategies. And so there's this one anecdote I like from a book called Labor is Capital by Teresa Gilarducci, where she talks about this union, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, which for many years only invested their pension plan in government securities because of this philosophical conviction that they wanted to remain aloof from the capitalist system. And Albino Barrera talks about this too, that this can, when you get too deep into the weeds thinking about some of these issues of moral entanglements in investing, it can be tempting to just say, I'm not going to invest at all. But he points out that keeping our funds in the bank is not harmless either, because banks themselves generate their own share of direct and indirect harms. And plus, when you, or you could say, I'm not going to put my money in a bank at all. You can just hoard your cash under the mattress. But this has ill effects too, because it's not morally right to do this because of the societal opportunity cost. When we hoard funds under our mattress, this makes funds less available, and it raises the cost of capital. So for businesses that we would consider to be mostly good or mostly morally run, it's going to make it more expensive for them to access the capital that they need to grow and to operate if we're withdrawing from the system entirely. So unfortunately, there's kind of no way of totally avoiding these complexities. We just have to delve into them. But one point that I think is kind of missed a lot of times is when we think about choosing from among bad investments, good investments, there's kind of this assumption that the set of available investments is static. So it's like we look at all the companies that are out there to invest in, or all of the opportunities that there are to invest in. We say some are morally problematic, some seem okay, some seem like maybe they could be okay if we did some sort of activist strategy and steered them in a better direction. But it treats the available set of investments as fixed. And so I want to argue that we shouldn't necessarily think that that's the case, because we're talking about such huge, when we're talking about university endowments, we're talking about such huge pools of capital that we can really think about creating new types of investments that we may not necessarily already find in the landscape. So this article by Purcell and Rose, which talks about CST and both investment and licensing, suggests that smaller CCUs could pool their endowments together and turn over investment decisions, either turn over investment decisions or have some sort of advisory body, including experts in CST, that could kind of advise these funds on ethical investing. And so the focus there in that article is mostly on how does pooling allow for reducing the costs of accessing this expertise in ethical advising. But I think that pooling of capital is also valuable because it makes possible new types of investment, as I mentioned. So this book I just referenced by Teresa Gilarducci, about who actually spoke at a King's event back in the fall, I believe. This book, Labor is Capital, kind of takes up this question of how should union pension funds be deployed. And so we saw that there was this union that only wanted to invest in government securities, but many scholars and activists have made the point over the years that union pension funds have so much money that they can essentially be deployed in ways that transcend some of these problems with the existing set of investments. And so here's another anecdote from Labor's Capital, talking about these unions that decided they wanted their pension funds to aid and induce construction of housing in New York City. And so they set up an agreement with the Chase Manhattan Bank, where they created a special division of mortgage loans that gave preference to working class applicants. And then they actually instructed the bank not to reveal where the mortgage backing had originated. So this is a creative example of, your pension fund has so much money that it doesn't just have to think about investing in things that it sees or things that it goes to an investment advisor and learns are already existing options. It can actually explore ways to create new types of investments that promote pro-social ends potentially better than existing categories of investment are able to. So, what are some innovative things that a pooled CCU endowment fund could do, and maybe what are some models for these things that already exist elsewhere? So, some things that I have in mind are, one example is lending to worker cooperatives. So, there's a lot of emphasis in the Catholic social teaching tradition and in the papal encyclical tradition about worker participation in the business. And in many cases, this can take the form of worker cooperatives. Unfortunately, worker cooperatives are not very common in practice, and they often face difficulties both coming into existence and growing because of difficulties in accessing financing. So this book by Gregory Dow called Governing the Firm kind of has a very detailed and very illuminating discussion of the obstacles that worker cooperatives face in competing with traditional firms for access to capital. So in places where worker cooperatives have taken root and have become viable at a larger scale, they've often had to find creative ways to solve this financing problem. So people like to talk about the Mondragon Corporation in the Basque region of Spain as an example of CST put into practice because Mondragon was actually started by a Catholic priest. But Mondragon has its own bank, which essentially its name changed a few years ago, but it's called the Laboral Cuxta, and it helps to sustain Mondragon and to promote the creation of new worker cooperatives that are part of the Mondragon Confederation. So perhaps part of a pooled CCU endowment fund could be used to establish something similar in the United States and try to help incubate worker cooperatives at a scale that they're currently not able to attain. Other things I'm thinking about are, this fund could try to facilitate non-usurious lending. So I'm thinking here, a model here would be the Mons Pietatis, or the Mounts of Piety, that were begun in Renaissance Europe times, in Renaissance times in Europe, or things that exist nowadays that are called free loan societies. So there's a organization in North America, well, actually, I think they're global as well, the International Association of Jewish Free Loans, which basically offers interest-free loans, and then grows their pool of capital over time by taking donations and repayment in excess of voluntary repayment in excess of what was loaned. And then lastly, a CCU fund could provide financing for Catholic institutions or even for others to undertake sustainability initiatives like installing solar panels. So a model here would be an organization like Catholic Energies, which exists to help connect parishes and schools with outside investor financing. But here, the financing could come from the CCU fund instead of from outside investors. And so the church could help to support its own institutions in meeting these goals. Okay, so just to wrap up here, I think I'm looking forward to hearing Margarita's thoughts about some of these proposals, but just to kind of address some criticisms that I think or objections that might be raised. One objection is that people might say these activities are too risky. So we're talking about things that are kind of speculative, unproven, things like worker cooperatives. One of the reasons why they face difficulty accessing capital markets is because they don't exist at a large scale. And so we don't really have a good way of judging how successful they are. But one point I would make is that the size of the endowment fund, I mean, again, we're talking about really large sums of money here, means that it should be feasible to experiment with some of these new types of investments while also allowing for adequate diversification. So I'm certainly not proposing, that this money be all plowed into one of these ideas. Another objection to the actual idea of pooling the funds is that donors may not like this because they may have preferences for supporting schools to which they have a personal connection. You donate to Georgetown because you went to Georgetown, you wanted to support Georgetown. And so they may not be inclined to support such a pooled fund. But donor gifts often sometimes come with restrictions or with stipulations about how they be used, and oftentimes they don't. So if we wanted to move towards this sort of model, it would be possible to explore ways of doing that start off by pooling unrestricted endowment assets and that don't necessarily violate any donor preferences. And, you know, to the point I made earlier about how CST kind of points toward a critique of inequality among CCUs, a benefit of endowment pooling is that it would help reduce inequalities among CCUs. So, you know, some of the less wealthy CCUs would get to benefit from the investment returns that would ordinarily be going just to the ones at the top. But just like any effort to reduce inequality, it might be difficult to get buy-in from those who would lose out as a result. So there are kind of like political obstacles potentially to setting up a system like this. And I think that's one of the thorniest questions to deal with. But I think, you know, there might be ways of gradually moving in this direction, potentially by, you know, not by drawing too quickly out of existing endowment assets, but by, you know, setting up a pooled fund that we start to seed initially with new donations. And potentially that would be one way of kind of overcoming some of this resistance from the larger institutions. Okay, so to conclude, you know, this problem of investing in light of CST has traditionally been framed as one of avoiding cooperation with evil, or maybe promoting cooperation with good. But the sheer magnitude of the endowment funds held by CCUs suggests that pooling and collective deployment of these funds could expand the space of available types of investment. And this might allow us to begin transcending some of the pressures within the capitalist system to generate these morally problematic investments in the first place. And lastly, as I mentioned, you know, this kind of pooling can ensure a more equitable distribution of investment returns across CCUs, which are pretty unequally distributed at present. So I will stop there and turn it over to Margarita for her comments, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt, for challenging us to think about the economics of Catholic higher education in a way that aligns more closely with our mission than the conventional way of framing it. In the decades since Ex Corde Ecclesiae, Catholic colleges and universities have more explicitly articulated their identity as Catholic institutions of higher learning and what that means. And I would say in the vast majority of instances, this has involved rediscovering visions of founders or key figures of the sponsoring religious communities. And often they've distilled that vision into a memorable phrase that reflects a commitment to the mission. I'd like to share just a few examples of those. At colleges sponsored by the Congregation of Holy Cross, like King's College, we're reminded of the words of the community's founder, Blessed Basil Moreau, that we are preparing citizens for earth and heaven. And as an alumna of a Jesuit university, I think I should also point to the fact that on the campus of any Jesuit college or university, students know they are expected to be or become people for others, as this often quoted section of Father Pedro Arrupe's speech to the Jesuit community in Valencia makes quite clear. And I would say even on campuses where the religious leader was not directly involved with the oversight of an institution of higher education, her words still imbue how the university sees its approach to forming students. And I think if we take a look at this excerpt from a document that Cabrini University shares with its community, and applying these visions to how Catholic colleges and universities finance what they do is truly critical. Matt, as you pointed out in your presentation, Bill Purcell and I had also been thinking about the potential power of pooled endowment funds of CCUs, but your reference to labor's capital and the other models in which institutions invest their assets in entities and activities that meet the needs of the vulnerable and marginalized really moved that argument forward. And I thank you for making those connections. Moreover, your analysis of the concentration of wealth among the top CCUs and your claim that such concentration itself contradicts Catholic social teaching are compelling. While I may have heard rumblings about this disparity for decades, I've not seen any analysis of either the economic or ethical implications of it for Catholic higher education as a whole. I would really like to see some further thoughtful reflection and discussion on both whether it's even feasible to share resources and how institutions would go about doing that. Perhaps some of the mergers we've seen in the past, typically male-founded institutions subsuming women-founded institutions, would be a starting point for that conversation. I'd like to turn now to the critiques that I suspect you would hear, and you anticipated some of them, from various corners of Catholic higher education. And again, although you've already anticipated a few, I'd like to outline what I think will be the immediate, if not thoughtful, reactions to your proposals. And the first would come from non-elite institutions, CCUs that one could argue are doing more to educate the marginalized and vulnerable than our elite ones. And I think that critique is the fact that we just don't have very large endowments. And every dollar we do have is needed to subsidize those students that our mission calls us to educate. And as you anticipated, the critique would be that we can't risk that proactive type of investment. But you had a fair response that we need not be constrained by current financial market offerings. There are more options out there that we could, with pooled investments, take advantage of. Another critique that might be offered from those with large endowments would be that the donors and the directors, the trustees, may resist any call to pool funds with less prestigious CCUs. You offer them an outlet by using unrestricted funds. And a thought I had was that might there be also an economic argument that the best use, which is what economists are supposed to be looking at, right? The best use of the institution's resources is to ensure the viability of CCUs more broadly. So on a related point, I'd like to know a little bit more about those who would be losing out from this proposed approach. I'd like to know a little bit more about who they are and what they are really losing. And the next critique or thought that I'd like to share, and perhaps this is the only one that is somewhat of a hesitation on my part. I do strongly support the notion of pooling endowment funds to be proactive in living out CST principles on the institutional level. But my one hesitation stems from a comment I heard from a colleague in a faculty meeting chat before this academic year began. And the question went something like this: will Kings get a share of the $1.4 billion in PPP received by the Catholic Church? It made me realize how a changing faculty demographic not only lacks an understanding of Catholic doctrine and perhaps Catholic culture, but there's also an ignorance about the finances of, quote, the Catholic Church. And my worry is, might this proposal about collective action further that misunderstanding? Could it convey a sense that there is this monolith of Catholic higher education? And then one further perspective on how the identity of Catholic colleges might be impacted by how we finance Catholic higher education appeared in a recent Commonweal article by Massimo Fagioli. And I'll summarize it rather succinctly with a question: how do we maintain Catholicity in face of corporatization? And then a final critique I'd like to offer, and while I realize you didn't set out to offer a very specific model, I suspect many of today's participants would respond with something like this: okay, this is great in theory, but if this is to happen, we need a practical model for coordination. So I have a few questions I'd like you to think about if you choose to answer them. And the first would go something like this. Could you offer a more concrete example of how CCUs would pool their endowments to finance for the common good? How close to the model of labor's capital could they get? And what obstacles do you anticipate in trying to construct that type of model? And how would they be overcome? So that would be one area. Another question would be, could you comment on the composition of boards of trustees, boards of directors at CCUs, which are typically dominated by alumni mainly, and alumni from the financial sector who may be uncomfortable with a radical departure from the status quo. And could you say something about whether the proposed model of pooling funds would raise a red flag about collusion or some type of anti-competitive practice on the part of CCUs? And finally, if CCUs fail to adopt this model that you're proposing and say non-Catholic private institutions beat them to it, could CCUs then be, in a sense, too late to the game to make a moral difference? So again, Matt, I thank you so much for challenging us to think about how to be Catholic colleges and universities. If we are to maintain our distinctive identity, we have to be more than what our private college peers are with a couple of required theology classes tacked on. I would argue if we don't live out the Catholic social tradition and how we use our resources, then not only will we miss the mark on mission, we may not even survive in the market of higher education. So there's some thoughts I had, and I'm open to any responses you'd like to share.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Margarita. These are really, really helpful comments and really stimulating points for further reflection. Let me see. I would just take, could you put that last slide back up actually for a minute? I think I wanted to take the last point first about, oh yeah, about being late to the game. So I don't know that that would be a major concern for a couple of reasons. So one thing is, I don't know that there is a lot of movement in this direction among non-Catholic colleges and universities. I don't know that there's really any kind of overarching principles or value system that would lead Harvard and Yale to decide they want to pool their endowments. Whereas in the Catholic context, it's clear what the shared value system that would be impelling that kind of coordination would be. So I don't really know that there's much issue with non-Catholic colleges moving in that direction. But if they did, I don't know that they would even be doing so for the same reasons that I'm contemplating here. So like to the point about creating a bank that could finance worker cooperatives, I don't even know that that would be the objective of a pooled Harvard-Yale endowment fund. Like that, they probably would not be after the same types of things. So I don't really know that there's much concern about like being beaten to the punch by some other confederation of universities here. To the point about like boards of trustees, I guess to the first point about a concrete example of how CCUs could pool their endowments. I think Bernard was the one who had originally mentioned to me, and then I think we had also discussed the example of Notre Dame and how Notre Dame's endowment and King's College's endowment are managed by the same entity, even though they're treated as distinct endowments. It's not that King's is part of Notre Dame's endowment. The other interesting thing that I learned recently is that even funds that we think of as one endowment are actually themselves made up of many smaller funds. And so Columbia University's endowment, for example, has been, a lot of people in the Graduate Students Union have been interested in doing research about exactly how the endowment is invested and where the money is coming from. So, when Columbia says they don't have money to pay their graduate students more, we can assess those claims. And it's interesting to know that the Columbia endowment is actually comprised of like hundreds of smaller funds, some of which have existed since before the founding of the United States. And a lot of them have restrictions that, they can't be, the principal can't ever be touched, or they can't ever be mingled with other funds. And so if we're thinking about a corporation, like setting up some kind of corporation to collectively manage the endowments of different schools, one thing I would say is that we already do have a model for something like that in this instance of Notre Dame and King's, but we also have a model for that just in the administration of any large university's endowment to begin with. It's almost like a corporation managing a whole bunch of different funds to begin with. So I think that's kind of what I would point to as a concrete model that we could look at. The point about composition of boards of trustees, I think is really interesting. I mean, I haven't looked too closely at this topic in particular, although I do think that Professor McCartan talked about this a little bit in his lecture on labor at Catholic universities, and he made the point about the trustees of Georgetown and their backgrounds. And so, yeah, I think that is something that I had in mind when I was thinking about like political resistance to implementing this kind of ideas. There might be a lot of status quo bias because those who currently manage the endowment or oversee the endowment, you're right, may think this is too radical a departure. And so I don't have a great answer for how to overcome that. I mean, I know that at many Catholic universities, there is at least nominal representation on the boards of members of the religious orders that run the schools, although in practice, my understanding is that their power is not as great as we might think it is. But perhaps those could be the voices initially trying to nudge things in this new direction. And to the point about anti-competitive practices, I'd have to think about that. I don't think that would really be a major concern here, especially because we would be talking about, all endowment funds are already investing in a lot of different activities. And so I don't think we're proposing here to like take the endowment fund and like buy out every company in one industry so that the endowment fund monopolizes a particular industry. Like Catholic universities just run all the airlines in the United States. I don't think that would be a concern. I think there would still, given that there would have to be diversification of such a fund, I don't think that anti-competitive practices would be too big a concern. Although what's interesting to that point is that there is economic research about how BlackRock and large investment funds of that sort own much more, own large chunks of major players in many industries. And so even industries that we think of as being fairly competitive, when you account for the fact that some of the major players are all basically owned by the same investors, are actually much more concentrated and much less competitive than you might think. So that's an interesting point.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. I'm going to join your screen here. Margarita, would you stop sharing? I've got to look at all these questions that keep popping up. Thanks to everybody who's sending questions along. I've got a number here. Let me start with this question, Matt. Are there Catholic colleges and universities, CCUs in the US, already employing some of these more creative investment strategies to which you've pointed? So is there precedent for what you're talking about? And I heard there's precedent in as much as endowments often are composed of many different endowments, but is there precedent with respect to these more creative investment strategies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not that I've really been able to find direct evidence for. I mean, I mentioned at the outset this point about divestment, and I think divestment has been a big issue at a lot of Catholic colleges and universities. So the University of Dayton, I believe, was the first Catholic university in the U.S. to divest from fossil fuels in the last few years following the release of Laudato Si. And there's an article in National Catholic Reporter from a few years ago about that decision. So I think there have certainly been efforts to be more methodical or more deliberate about how endowments are invested. But I don't have I don't really have any direct evidence of involvement in the specific types of things I was talking about, like financing worker cooperatives. That I'm not aware of.
So I've got two questions that go together here. So praise for both of you, talk and response, Matt and Margarita. Matt, pooling seems difficult. Could you speak a bit more about how we might move incrementally in that direction by, say, first asking CCUs to tithe to a pooled fund? So how do we move more incrementally? Is that one way to do it, this tithing to a pooled fund? Do you have any other ideas? And then I'll follow up with the second question.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly sounds like a reasonable idea. I guess, I was trying to get at a little bit before the point about people, there tends to be more resistance to taking from something that already exists and putting it into something new, rather than to taking future money that would be coming into some fund and redirecting it into a different place. And so I had alluded a little bit to, maybe saying that going forward, the university is going to pledge all of its unrestricted donations into this fund or something like that. I mean, I don't think that that would be as effective at dealing with the inequality among CCU funds as if we were taking directly from the larger funds and putting into a common fund. But it might be a more palatable way of doing it if there would otherwise be that resistance. I mean, I think about the fact that in the US, there's no wealth tax, but there are capital gains taxes. So there are taxes on capital income, but not on the existing stock of capital. And so you could think about that similarly, like there might be less resistance to saying we're going to take future donations and divert a portion of them into a fund, rather than saying we're going to dip into the existing funds and put into the common fund.
Good. You've anticipated, I'm sorry, Margarita, please.
Yeah, it perhaps could be a progressive tithe, that those with more resources might contribute a higher percentage.
Second question, which you anticipated to some extent. So Matt, you seem to be accepting the vast concentration of wealth that has led to these big endowments in higher ed. So especially among non-CCUs, though to some extent among some CCUs. Are there not public policy actions we should also be pursuing to tax wealth to support higher ed, moving away from relying so heavily on wealthy patrons?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's a point that people have made about private university endowments in general. I believe that the 2017 tax reform included some provision to start taxing private university endowments. And it was interesting actually to see like how the traditional sides in the political debate about taxation were almost reversed in that case, because ordinarily you would expect, progressives to be advocating taxing large pools of capital and conservatives to be opposing it. And yet it seemed in that case like conservatives were more in favor of this idea because it was in some way going after liberal universities, and progressives were concerned about it for the same reason. But no, I think that's a very fair point, that I think we should be concerned about large private concentration of capital in general, regardless of whether it's occurring under the auspices of church institutions or not. And so certainly I think that that is some like taxation of endowment assets is something that needs to be explored further. But in the meantime, given that, well, you may say this idea is unrealistic too, but given that it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to have some kind of large leveling of university endowment wealth through public policy, in the meantime, I think it's worth exploring these voluntary measures as well.
Let me ask us a quick factual question, since I don't want this to be lost. There's a question about why is it, if you know, that the endowments of Catholic colleges and universities performed a little better than the endowments of non-Catholic colleges and universities. So you gave us those statistics earlier in the talk.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if it's like a statistically significant difference. It seems like it might be. It was like a percentage point higher, but the iPads data doesn't really say much about like how the endowments are invested. So I did a little bit with trying to look at like reports for individual colleges to see like how they were investing their endowments, but I think it's hard to get at that systematically. And yeah, it's a good question, like whether Catholic colleges are kind of systematically investing differently. I wouldn't think they would be, because a lot of these, investment decisions are turned over to professional managers. So I don't have a great answer for that.
Again, factual, and the answer again might be no, we don't know. Are there data publicly available to make it clear how universities, whether Catholic or not, spend their endowments. So for example, Georgetown, according to this question, spends nearly all of its endowment in order to meet full need of tuition of students so that they won't graduate with more than $25,000 of loans. But are data like that available, or what do you do to find?
I mean, I'm not sure if they're available in any centralized location, but again, those things are usually available by looking at like the finance reports for individual universities. So I know for Columbia, again, this conversation that I've been involved with recently about how Columbia is spending its endowment, there is a formula that's used to determine the spending out of the endowment in any given year, and it involves some kind of weighted average of spending over the last few years, and then some percentage of the gross return, marked down to account for the fact that we need to preserve the value of the endowment over time. And so I imagine that basically every university has some kind of formula like that, although some may be less mathematical about it and use more discretion on a year-to-year basis. But usually I think those things are stated somewhere in the university's reports about their assets.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Two last questions, and Margarita, do speak up again, please. So one has to do with whether state systems that pool their endowments might offer a concrete model. And then question goes along with that one. What are the obstacles? So, are merged charters and boards obstacles here? So again, state systems that pool their endowments, is that a concrete model? And do you have any thoughts about obstacles other than those you've discussed? So merged charters, boards, et cetera.
So I think the question was directed at either of us. And I really don't have that much knowledge of how the state systems pool their endowments. My only reference point is Pennsylvania, the PASHE system, Pennsylvania system of state system of higher education. And I know that system's under stress. Some are under intense review for perhaps merging. But that's a merging of the institution as a whole. So I really don't know that much about it, but certainly I think any model is worth looking at to see what would be something that, what would work in the Catholic higher education context. State systems would have some legal, legislative mandate to cooperate in some way that, something short of a statement from even something from the Usccb wouldn't require Catholic colleges to cooperate, because very few are chartered. Is anything more than Catholic University of America chartered through the Usccb? That's the only one I know of. I know there are a few diocesan universities across the country, but most are founded by religious communities, and some now, or most now, under the governance of a lay board. So I'm not sure how well that model would work, but I think it's always worth looking at others.
Okay, last question. And it could, again, be for both of you, but Matt, this one's, I think, directed to you. So have you spoken with VPs of Institutional Advancement about this proposal of possibly pooling funds? So have you? And if you haven't, that would be an interesting conversation, and it'd be interesting to speculate about how they might respond.
Yeah, I haven't. I don't really know any or have any context, but if anybody can put me in touch with someone who they think would like to have a conversation about this, I'd be happy to explore that.
Yeah, I think that would be well worthwhile, and with presidents too, just to see how this idea, which might seem really radical, but I think it has lots of potential, depending on how it might be developed and deployed. Margarita, did you want to say more?
I did think vice presidents of business affairs would be the ones who were more actively involved with the management of the funds. So not just institutional advancement, but treasurers and so forth would be good people to speak. And of course, the presidents.
Very good. Thanks to you both, and thanks to everybody who's joined us and stayed with us to the end. I'll send out the recording sometime later today, most likely, maybe tomorrow. Thanks for a really interesting discussion. Thanks for very good questions from our audience. And if you'd like, again, the last event in the Catholic Higher Education and Catholic Higher Education in Light of Catholic Social Thought series is happening tomorrow. So if you want more information about that, maybe shoot me an email and I'd be glad to give it to you. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Margarita. And everybody have a good evening.
Thank you.